I step out of my Civic at 6:14 a.m. and the streetlights are still on, throwing long shadows across Melissa's driveway. November in Chicago, the kind of cold that makes your lungs tight. 3 black SUVs parked at angles across the front lawn, doors open, engines running. A woman in a windbreaker with yellow letters walks past me carrying a cardboard box marked evidence, and she nods like we're neighbors taking out the trash on the same morning. Greg comes out the front door in sweatpants and an old Bears jersey, no shoes, and he sees me standing there by my car. His face does something I've never seen before. Not anger, recognition. Like a man who just understood the punchline to a joke he's been telling for 16 years. "You," he says, and his voice cracks on that one syllable. 2 agents in tactical vests step between us before he makes it off the porch. One of them says something I can't hear, and Greg's knees buckle, just slightly, and they guide him sideways against the garage door, his palms flat against the white paint. Melissa appears in the doorway in her bathrobe, the blue one she wore to Clara's funeral, and she's screaming something about lawyers and warrants, but the words blur together. A neighbor 3 houses down has her phone up, recording. Another one stands on his porch in a robe, coffee mug frozen halfway to his mouth. The lead agent walks toward me with a manila folder. "Mr. Chen, we appreciate your cooperation with this investigation. If you could wait inside your vehicle, we'll need a brief statement before you leave." I nod. My hands don't shake. They haven't shaken in 19 months. Melissa collapses onto the grass, wet with overnight frost, and I watch her bathrobe soak through at the knees. She's looking at me now, really looking, maybe for the first time since Clara died. The thing about being invisible is that people forget you can see them too. Let me go back. Let me show you how we got here. 4 years ago, my wife Clara died on a Tuesday morning in October. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the last breath she took in the hospice room, with the window that faced the parking lot. I held her hand and she said, "Raymond, don't disappear." And I didn't understand what she meant until I already had. The grief was a physical thing. It lived in my chest like a second heart, heavier than the first, and for 6 months I moved through the world like a man underwater, everything muted, everything slow. I took a leave of absence from the bank where I'd worked fraud investigation for 23 years. I told myself it was temporary. Greg called 2 weeks after the funeral. "Ray, I know this is a terrible time, but I'm in a bind with the quarterly taxes and you know numbers better than anyone. Could you take a look? Just this once." Just this once became every quarter, then monthly reconciliations, then payroll processing every other Friday, then vendor contract reviews, then managing the company's entire back office while Greg handled sales and Melissa handled what she called brand management, which meant posting photos of job sites on Instagram. I told myself I was helping family. I told myself it gave me purpose when I needed it most. I told myself Clara would have wanted me to stay connected. The bungalow where I live now is the one Clara's grandmother left us in her will, 1,800 square feet on the northwest side, near the Polish bakery and the church with the copper steeple, the neighborhood where Clara grew up. Every room still has something of hers, her coffee mug in the cabinet, the one with the Wisconsin lighthouse from our last anniversary trip. Her garden tools in the basement, still carrying soil from the last tomatoes she planted. The quilt her mother made folded on the back of the couch. I'm 57. I worked my whole adult life solving other people's financial crimes, tracing shell companies and phantom invoices and wire transfers that didn't add up. I was good at it. The kind of good where you can look at a spreadsheet and see the lie buried in column F, row 83. The kind of good where you can build a case so airtight the defense attorney thanks you for your thoroughness before he advises his client to plead. And I took that precision, that ability to see patterns, and I aimed it at keeping my brother-in-law's construction company solvent while he told clients I was just filling in between real jobs. The work itself wasn't complicated. Greg ran a mid-sized commercial construction outfit, 30 employees, revenues between 4 and 7 million depending on the year. I processed payroll every other Friday, made sure withholdings were correct, filed the 941s quarterly, managed the workers' comp renewals. I reviewed vendor contracts before Greg signed them because he'd been burned twice by automatic renewal clauses he hadn't noticed. I maintained the company's relationship with their bank because Greg hated reading loan covenants. I did this for 16 years without a salary. Greg would say, "Ray, you know we'd pay you if we could afford it, but margins are tight and you've got Clara's pension, right?" And I'd nod because I did have Clara's pension, a small one from her 20 years teaching elementary school, enough to cover the property taxes and groceries and the utility bills in a house I owned outright. Melissa would say, "Raymond's between opportunities right now. He's figuring things out," when people asked what I did. This at family gatherings, church functions, the parties she threw for Greg's clients where I'd arrive early to set up chairs and leave before dessert to clean the office. At Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I sat at the main table. Clara had been gone a year, and I was still Raymond who lost his wife, still temporarily broken, still deserving of some baseline courtesy. Melissa asked me to say grace, and I did, and Greg's mother squeezed my hand afterward. The next Thanksgiving I sat at the kids' table, literally, the folding table in the sunroom where Greg and Melissa's daughters sat with their boyfriends and the neighbors' teenagers. Melissa guided me there with a hand on my elbow and said brightly, "The adults are discussing business things you wouldn't understand. You'll be more comfortable here." I sat between a 17-year-old on his phone and an empty chair. I ate turkey that had gone cold. I excused myself before pie and drove to the hospice cemetery where Clara was buried, and I sat on the bench near her stone until my legs went numb from the cold. That was 2 years ago. 6 weeks ago was this year's Thanksgiving. I wasn't invited to sit anywhere. I was invited to arrive at 10 a.m. to help set up tables and leave by 2 p.m. before guests arrived, because Melissa needed family time to be intimate. I helped set up the tables. I left at 1:50. I drove home and ate a sandwich standing at my kitchen counter, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone in Greg's family had asked me a question about my own life. Not, "How are you managing, Raymond?" Not, "What have you been working on?" Not, "Do you need anything?" Just, "Can you file this? Can you fix that? Can you call the insurance company because they won't listen to us, but they'll listen to you?" The financial work I did for Greg wasn't casual favor territory. It was sophisticated, detailed, necessary work that kept the company compliant with state and federal regulations. It kept them eligible for bonding, which they needed to bid on commercial contracts. It kept them out of payroll tax trouble, which could have shut them down in 90 days. I saved them, conservatively, $70,000 a year in accounting fees and penalties. For 16 years, that's $112 million in value. And Greg told the guy who serviced their bulldozers that I couldn't hold down employment since Clara passed. I heard him say it. I was in the back office filing vendor W-9s, and Greg was in the front office signing off on a repair invoice, and the mechanic asked, "Ray, still doing your books?" And Greg laughed and said, "Yeah, keeps him busy, gives him something to do since he can't seem to hold down a real job anymore." The mechanic made a sympathetic sound. I stood very still in the back office, holding a W-9 form for a plumbing subcontractor, and something in my chest rearranged itself. I didn't confront him. I didn't say anything. I filed the W-9, and I finished processing that week's payroll, and I went home and I sat at my kitchen table until midnight, doing something I should have done years earlier. I pulled every bank record, every tax return, every payroll file, every ledger entry going back 16 years, and I found it. Column F, row 83. except it was column L, rows 12 through 946. Greg had been listing me as a paid consultant on the company books, not a volunteer, not a family favor, a $95,000 per year salaried consultant present on every quarterly tax filing, every year-end P&L, every Schedule C attached to his personal returns. The payments were recorded, the tax withholdings were calculated, the expense was deducted. The money never came to me. I sat at that table and I did the math 3 times because I couldn't believe it. 16 years, $95,000 per year, some years slightly more to account for cost of living increases, $1,052 million, $1.52 million in phantom wages that Greg had paid himself while recording them as payments to me. My hands shook when I printed the first spreadsheet. They didn't shake again after that. I'm a fraud investigator, was a fraud investigator. The skills don't disappear just because you're not carrying a badge anymore. I know how to read a shell game. I know how to trace money through multiple accounts. I know the difference between a mistake and a scheme. This was a scheme. I spent 3 days going through everything. I created a timeline. I cross-referenced bank deposits against reported income. I found the pattern Greg had used. He'd write himself checks from the company account, deposit them into his personal account, then record them as consultant payments, R. Chen in the books. Elegant, really. If anyone audited the company, they'd see a legitimate expense for professional services. If anyone asked Greg, he could say his brother-in-law helped with the books. Everyone in the family knew I did work for the company. The lie was hidden inside a truth. I kept digging. Clara's parents died within 6 months of each other during year 9 of my unpaid service to Greg's company. Her father first, a stroke, then her mother, heart failure, like she couldn't figure out how to keep going without him. They left everything to their 3 children, Clara, her sister Diane, and Greg, equal 3-way split. The house, the savings, the investment accounts, the life insurance, about $890,000 total. Clara was already gone by then, so her third came to me as her surviving spouse, $296,667, except it didn't. I remember the meeting with the estate attorney. Greg and Melissa were there, Diane and her husband, me. The attorney laid out the assets, explained the timeline for settling the estate, said distribution would happen within 90 days. Then Greg said, "Before we distribute, I need to address a loan my father-in-law made me 7 years ago, $340,000. It was informal, no paperwork, but I've been making payments through Raymond. Dad considered it settled, but technically it should come out of my inheritance share." I looked at him across that conference table. I said, "What loan?" Greg smiled, said, "Ray, you've been helping me manage the books you know about the loan. Dad lent it to me for the business expansion in 2015. You've been processing my repayments every month." I had no memory of this. I had no record of this. I said, "I don't remember that." The attorney looked at me. Greg looked at me. Melissa looked at me. Diane looked at me. Greg said gently, "Raymond, I know you've been struggling with memory issues since Clara passed. I've been processing the payments through you so you could track them. For Dad's records, I think you've just forgotten." The attorney asked if I had documentation. I said I'd need to check my files. Greg said warmly, "Take your time, Ray, we're family. This isn't adversarial." The meeting ended. I went home. I searched every file I had for the company. Nothing. No loan, no repayments, no documentation of any transfer between Greg and Clara's father. I called the attorney and said I couldn't find records of the loan Greg mentioned. The attorney said Greg had provided documentation, a promissory note signed by Clara's father, a ledger of payments, cancelled checks made out to the estate of Donald Kowalski, with loan repayment in the memo line. I asked to see the documentation. The attorney sent it over. The promissory note looked legitimate. The signature looked like Clara's father's handwriting. The checks were real. I could see them in the company's bank records going back 7 years, monthly payments of $4,000 to Donald Kowalski's estate account, marked loan repayment. I remembered processing those checks every month, $4,000 to Donald Kowalski. Greg had told me they were for ongoing maintenance on a rental property Clara's parents owned that Greg's company managed. I'd recorded them as vendor payments. I'd processed my own disinheritance $4,000 at a time for 7 years. The estate settled. The $340,000 loan was deducted from Greg's share, which meant instead of receiving $296,667, I received nothing. The math worked out to Greg receiving $6,767 from his wife's parents' estate, Diane receiving $296,666.67, and Raymond receiving 0.00 because the phantom loan exactly offset my wife's inheritance. I signed the papers because I didn't know how to prove it was a lie. Let me tell you about Clara's grandmother's bungalow, the house where I'm standing right now. It's the only thing no one could take from me because it passed to Clara and me 20 years ago, before any of this started. The deed has both our names. When Clara died, her half came to me automatically. No estate to settle, no probate, just mine. This house saved me. Not metaphorically, literally, because I have no retirement savings. I have Clara's small pension, $1,847 per month. I have no current income. If I'd been renting, I'd be in a studio apartment in a building with bars on the windows, choosing between medication and groceries. Instead, I'm in this bungalow where every room still smells faintly of the lavender soap Clara used, where her handwriting is still on the emergency contact list on the refrigerator, where I can walk to the Polish bakery on Division Street and order black coffee and a patsky, and sit in the corner booth where we sat every Saturday for 22 years. The house is my fortress. It's also my cage, because I can't afford to leave it. After I discovered the phantom salary scheme and the inheritance fraud, I spent 2 weeks being quietly, carefully furious. Not the hot kind of anger that makes you do something stupid. The cold kind, the kind that wants documentation. I went back further into the records. If Greg had stolen from me twice, maybe there was more. I found the credit cards, 3 business credit cards in my name that I'd never applied for. Greg had opened them using my social security number during year 4 of my volunteer work, when I'd given him my information for some insurance paperwork. The cards had been used for personal expenses, vacations, restaurant meals, Melissa's car payment, and then paid off using company funds recorded as consultant expense reimbursements. Another $180,000 over 12 years. I found the vendor kickback scheme. Greg had been billing clients for materials at market rate, then purchasing them from suppliers who gave him rebates, then pocketing the difference and recording it as finder's fees paid to R. Chen. Another $95,000 over 8 years. I found the equipment rental fraud. The company owned its own excavator and backhoe. Greg rented them out to other contractors on weekends. The rental income was recorded as equipment consulting fees, R. Chen, and deposited into an account I'd never heard of. Another $67,000 over 6 years. I sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets covering every surface, and I added it up. $152 million in phantom salary, $340,000 in fraudulent loan deductions from my inheritance, $180,000 in credit card fraud, $95,000 in vendor kickbacks, $67,000 in equipment rental fraud, $2,202,000, $2.2 million stolen using my name, my identity, my labor, my silence. And I had processed most of it myself. I had entered the numbers into the ledgers, filed the tax returns, recorded the transactions. I had been the instrument of my own destruction because I trusted my brother-in-law, and I was too grief-sick to look closely at what I was actually filing. The night I finished that calculation, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room in the dark, and I felt Clara's absence like a physical presence. She would have noticed. She would have asked questions. She would have protected me from this because I was too useful, too compliant, too eager to be needed. "Don't disappear," she'd said. But I had. I disappeared so thoroughly that my own family could commit federal crimes in my name, and I'd process the paperwork with my own hands. The next morning, I drove to the FBI's field office on Roosevelt Road. I asked for the Financial Crimes Division. I waited in a lobby with corporate motivational posters on the walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. An agent named Sarah Voss called me into a conference room. She was maybe 40, dark hair pulled back, wedding ring on her left hand, notepad and pen in front of her, but nothing else. She asked how she could help. I said, "My brother-in-law has been committing wire fraud using my identity for 16 years. I have documentation." She blinked once, said, "Okay, tell me." I told her everything. The phantom salary, the inheritance fraud, the credit cards, the vendor kickbacks, the equipment rentals. I spoke for an hour and 12 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I presented it like I used to present cases when I worked fraud investigation. Clean, linear, documented. Agent Voss took notes. When I finished, she said, "Mr. Chen, do you understand that if we investigate this and find evidence of what you're describing, your brother-in-law will face federal charges that carry prison time?" I said yes. She said, "And your sister-in-law may also face charges as an accessory or co-conspirator." I said yes. She said, "Are you prepared for the impact this will have on your family relationships?" I said, "Agent Voss, I haven't had a family relationship in 4 years. I've had an unpaid job where my employers steal my identity between asking me to fix their printer." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Recognition, maybe. She said, "Do you have the documentation with you?" I handed her 3 binders. She spent 40 minutes flipping through them while I sat quietly and watched her face change. By the time she reached the inheritance section, she'd stopped taking notes. She was just reading. Finally, she closed the last binder. She said, "Mr. Chen, this isn't a family misunderstanding. This is wire fraud, identity theft, tax fraud, and possible money laundering. This is a federal case. If you file a formal complaint, we will investigate. Do you want to proceed?" I thought about Thanksgiving, about the kids' table, about Greg's mother's 80th birthday party 6 months ago, where Melissa whispered to the photographer that I wasn't really family, just someone Greg helped out, and I got excluded from the photo. About every family gathering where I arrived early to set up and left before the guests, because my presence was useful, but not welcome. I said, yes. Agent Voss assigned the case to a specialist in Denver who handled complex financial fraud, a woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, forensic accountant, who sounded bored on our first phone call until she opened my binders and went silent for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Chen, did you investigate fraud professionally?" I said, 23 years with Bank of America's Security Division. She said, "That explains why this case file is better documented than 90% of what the Bureau produces internally. When can we meet?" We met 6 times over 3 months. Dr. Huang was methodical, clinical, exhausting. She requested documentation I didn't know existed. She interviewed the company's accountant, their bank, 3 former vendors, 2 clients. She subpoenaed records going back to before I started working for Greg. She called me one night at 8:30 p.m. and said, "Mr. Chen, we found another $380,000 in fraudulent deductions your brother-in-law took using your name. Did you know he claimed you as a dependent on his personal taxes for 11 years?" I did not know that. She said, "He stopped the year your wife died, probably because it became harder to justify. But for 11 years he claimed you as a qualifying relative dependent, which reduced his personal tax burden by about $35,000 per year. Total benefit, $385,000. I sat in my dark living room and I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out like a cough. Dr. Huang said carefully, "Mr. Chen, are you all right?" I said, "I was his dependent. While I was doing his books for free, while he was stealing my inheritance, while he was telling people I couldn't hold a job, I was literally his dependent on paper." She said, "Yes, I'm sorry." I said, "Don't be. Add it to the file." The investigation took 19 months. During that time, I continued working for Greg. I processed every payroll, filed every quarterly return, managed every vendor contract. I showed up early and stayed late, and I never once let my face show what I knew. This is what people don't understand about the kind of anger I was carrying. It wasn't hot, it wasn't impulsive. It was a project. It had a timeline. It had deliverables. The FBI needed me to maintain normalcy. They needed Greg to continue his patterns so they could document ongoing criminal activity. They needed current transactions to prove the fraud wasn't historical and abandoned. So I became a cooperating witness. I wore a wire twice. I recorded conversations. I documented every interaction where Greg or Melissa disparaged my employment status, my mental state, my capabilities. I was fixing the office printer one evening after everyone had gone home. It was jamming on every third page, and Greg needed a client proposal printed for a morning meeting. The printer was in the main office. The accountant's office was adjacent, separated by a wall that didn't go all the way to the ceiling. I heard Melissa's voice through the wall. She was on the phone with the accountant. I heard her say, "David, Raymond's the family charity case. He barely functions. No one would believe him over Greg. Just backdate whatever you need for the audit. If Raymond asks questions, I'll handle it." The accountant said something I couldn't hear. Melissa said, "He's not going to ask questions. He doesn't even understand what he's filing. He just does what Greg tells him. That's all he's been good for since Clara died." I stood very still next to that printer. My phone was in my pocket. I took it out. I opened the voice recorder. I recorded 17 minutes of Melissa and the accountant discussing how to manipulate records to hide Greg's personal use of company funds, how to minimize my access to certain files, how to justify expenses that didn't make sense. At one point, Melissa said, "Raymond's so desperate to feel useful that he'll sign anything. It's actually sad." The accountant laughed. I saved the recording. I sent it to Agent Voss. I fixed the printer. I went home. That night I slept 8 hours for the first time in 4 years. Somewhere around month 14 of the investigation, Greg invited me to dinner. Not a family thing, just him and me. He said he wanted to discuss business, and could we meet at Romano's, the Italian place near the office. I said sure. I arrived 10 minutes early. Greg was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a man I didn't recognize. Suit, briefcase, wedding ring, law firm partner energy. Greg introduced him as Kenneth Pruitt, the company's corporate attorney. Not the accountant, not the business manager, the attorney. I sat down, I ordered water, I waited. Greg said, "Ray, I want to thank you for all the work you've done for the company over the years. You've been invaluable." I nodded. He said, "I know we haven't been able to compensate you properly, and I want to make that right. Ken and I have been reviewing the company's financial position, and we think we can offer you a one-time payment to cover your contributions." Kenneth slid a piece of paper across the table, a check already filled out, made out to Raymond Chen, $28,000. Greg said, "I know it's not perfect compensation for 16 years, but it's what we can responsibly do right now without jeopardizing the business, and I want you to know how much we appreciate you." I looked at the check. I looked at Greg. I looked at Kenneth. I said, "Can I ask a question?" Greg said, Of course. I said, this $28,000, is this in addition to the $152 million you've been paying me on paper for the last 16 years, or is this instead of it? The temperature in that booth dropped 40 degrees. Kenneth's face went professionally blank. Greg's face did something complicated. Greg said slowly, "Ray, I'm not sure what you're talking about." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. I placed it on the table between the check and the breadbasket. I said, "This is a photocopy of a target letter that was delivered to your business address 6 weeks ago. I signed for it as the company's registered agent. You are being investigated by the FBI for wire fraud, tax fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Your sister-in-law is being investigated as an accessory. Your accountant is cooperating with federal investigators. The grand jury convenes in 60 days. I stood up. I left the check on the table. I took the envelope with me. I walked out of Romano's, and I sat in my car in the parking lot, and my hands were completely steady on the steering wheel. Greg called me 14 times that night. I didn't answer. Melissa called 9 times. I didn't answer. Their attorney called twice and left a voicemail asking me to please call him back to discuss this misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was a 19-month federal investigation that was about to go public. The next 3 months were a controlled demolition. The FBI executed search warrants on Greg's office, his home, and the accountant's office. They seized computers, file cabinets, external hard drives, 12 years of paper records. They froze the company's primary bank account pending asset forfeiture proceedings. Greg's attorney tried to negotiate. He claimed the phantom salary was a bookkeeping error. He claimed Greg had always intended to pay me, but the payments were delayed due to cash flow issues. He claimed the inheritance loan was legitimate and Raymond's memory problems had caused confusion. Dr. Huang's testimony demolished every defense. She appeared via video link from the Denver field office, sitting in front of a wall of filing cabinets, speaking in the same bored monotone she'd used on our first call. She said, "The defendant's salary payments to Raymond Chen were recorded with mathematical precision every pay period for 16 years. They were reported to the IRS. They were used to reduce corporate tax burden. They were never deposited into any account belonging to Raymond Chen. This is not a bookkeeping error. This is systematic wire fraud." She said, "The loan documents provided by the defendant contain inconsistencies with the decedent's known handwriting and signature patterns. The repayment schedule exactly matches the inheritance amount owed to Raymond Chen. The timing of the loan's revelation, immediately prior to estate distribution, follows a pattern consistent with inheritance fraud." She said, "The credit cards, vendor kickbacks, and equipment rental schemes all utilized Raymond Chen's identity and tax identification number. The defendant had access to this information through his role as Raymond Chen's employer, a role that existed on paper but not in reality, as no wages were ever paid." The attorney tried to interrupt. Dr. Huang kept talking. Her voice never changed pitch. She presented evidence like she was reading a grocery list. The grand jury returned indictments on 17 counts. Greg's construction company lost every major contract within 3 weeks. Clients don't like doing business with companies under federal investigation for fraud. The bonding company pulled their coverage. Without bonding, they couldn't bid on commercial work. Without commercial work, the revenue stream disappeared. The company filed for bankruptcy protection. The employees, 30 people who had nothing to do with Greg's fraud, lost their jobs. I felt terrible about that. I still do. But I didn't cause it. Greg caused it. He built a business on stolen money and fraudulent deductions, and when the foundation collapsed, everyone standing on it fell. Melissa's parents were subpoenaed. They'd received a $50,000 gift from Greg 4 years ago, recorded as a business consulting fee paid to Melissa's father, a retired machinist who had never consulted on anything. The IRS wanted to know if they'd reported it as income. They hadn't. Greg's mother was subpoenaed. She'd received monthly payments of $200 for household management services for the company, recorded as contract labor. She'd never worked for the company. She'd never reported the income. Diane and her husband were subpoenaed. They'd borrowed $85,000 from Greg for a down payment on their house, recorded as a business loan repayment from an entity that didn't exist. The contamination spread through the family like a virus. Everyone who'd benefited from Greg's generosity discovered that the generosity was funded by fraud, and the IRS wanted to have a conversation about it. The relatives who'd vouched for Greg's character started receiving letters from federal investigators. The relatives who'd dismissed my instability started calling their accountants. The relatives who'd seated me at the kids' table started avoiding extended family gatherings. I received exactly one call from Diane during this period. She said, "Raymond, what did you do?" I said, "I reported a crime." She said, "You destroyed the family." I said, "Greg destroyed the family. I documented it." She hung up. I haven't spoken to her since. Greg's trial was scheduled for October. The prosecutor offered a plea deal in August. 7 years in federal prison, full restitution to all defrauded parties, permanent ban from operating a business that handles other people's money. Greg's attorney advised him to take it. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Huang's documentation was flawless. My testimony as a cooperating witness would be devastating. Greg took the deal. Melissa was offered her own deal. 3 years probation, cooperation with the restitution process, testimony against the accountant if his case went to trial. She took it. The accountant fought. His case went to trial. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days. I walked the jury through every fraudulent entry, every backdated document, every conversation I'd recorded where he discussed hiding Greg's crimes. The jury convicted him on all counts. He got 4 years. Asset forfeiture proceedings took everything. The company was liquidated. Greg and Melissa's house was seized and sold. Their retirement accounts were frozen and distributed to fraud victims, primarily me, but also the IRS for unpaid taxes and the employees who'd lost their jobs without severance. Greg's mother's monthly payments stopped. She called me once, crying, asking if I could help her. I said gently, "I can't. I'm sorry." She said, "How can you be so cruel?" I hung up and I blocked her number. Melissa's parents lost their home, refinancing it to pay the tax penalties on the gift they'd received. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building near the airport. Melissa's mother sent me a letter asking if I was satisfied now that I'd destroyed her daughter's marriage and her own retirement. I didn't respond. Diane's husband called me and said, "We're going to lose the house because of you." I said, "You're going to lose the house because you borrowed money you knew was stolen." He said, "You always thought you were better than us." I said, "No. I just thought I was family." He hung up. The restitution process took 11 months. Federal marshals tracked down every dollar Greg had hidden. They found offshore accounts. They found cash deposits in safe deposit boxes. They found cryptocurrency wallets. They found bearer bonds in a storage unit registered to Melissa's maiden name. By the time they finished, they'd recovered $187 million of the $2.2 million Greg had stolen from me. The remainder was declared uncollectible. Greg had spent it. Vacations, cars, home improvements, private school tuition for his daughters, Melissa's cosmetic procedures, restaurant meals, country club memberships. I received a check from the Federal Restitution Fund for $1,847,392.18. I deposited it into a new account at a bank where I'd never worked. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, and I tried to feel something. Victory, maybe. Relief. Satisfaction. I felt tired. Greg is serving his sentence at a minimum security federal facility in Wisconsin. He'll be eligible for release in 5 years if he maintains good behavior. Melissa moved in with her parents in their airport apartment. She works at a Sprint store. Her daughters won't speak to her. The accountant is at a facility in Indiana. His wife divorced him. His accounting license was permanently revoked. I am 57 years old. I live alone in Clara's grandmother's bungalow. I have $1,247 million in the bank, and Clara's pension, and no mortgage, and no debt. I also have no family, no invitations to Thanksgiving, no awkward birthday obligations, no emergency calls about printer jams or tax deadlines, no more pretending that people who steal from you love you. Every Saturday morning, I walk to the Polish bakery on Division Street. I order black coffee and a paczki, whichever flavor they made that morning. I sit in the corner booth where Clara and I sat for 22 years. I bring a book. Sometimes I read it. Sometimes I just watch people. Last Saturday, a woman sat down across from me without asking. She was maybe 60, grey hair, kind face. She said, "You're Raymond Chen." I said, "Yes." She said, "I worked with your wife, Clara. I taught 3rd grade, she taught 5th, we were friends." I said, "I remember you, Nancy." She said, "That's right." She paused. "I heard what happened with your brother-in-law, with the trial." I said, "Yes." She said, "Clara would be proud of you." I said, "I'm not sure about that." She said, "I am. She used to worry about you being too kind, too willing to help. She said you'd give someone the shirt off your back and then apologize for it being wrinkled." I laughed. That sounded like Clara. Nancy said, "What you did wasn't cruel. It was necessary. There's a difference." She stood up. She squeezed my shoulder. She left. I sat in that booth for another hour thinking about the difference between kindness and self-erasure, between helping and disappearing, between family and people who use the word family to extract things from you. If you've ever been seated at the children's table by people you've carried for decades, let me ask you something. Were you ever family to them, or just someone too useful to acknowledge? Because there's a difference, and recognizing that difference might be the thing that saves your life. The manila envelope that started this whole thing, the one I brought to Romano's to show Greg the target letter, that envelope has history. It's thick yellow paper, the kind that doesn't tear easily, with a metal clasp. Clara received her college acceptance letter in that envelope 34 years ago. She kept it because her grandmother had addressed it by hand, written Clara's name in careful cursive on the front. Years later, Clara stored her final medical directives in that envelope. The DNR order, the hospice paperwork, the letter she wrote to me that I wasn't supposed to read until after she died. I read it on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after her funeral. She wrote, "Raymond, don't disappear. Don't let people take you for granted just because you're useful. Don't mistake being needed for being loved. You deserve more than you think you do." I didn't understand what she meant, not then. After the investigation concluded, after the trial, after the restitution, I put the FBI documentation in that envelope. The target letter, the grand jury indictment, the plea agreement, the restitution order. Now the envelope hangs on my refrigerator, held by a magnet Clara bought at a farmer's market in Wisconsin during our last anniversary trip. The envelope is empty. I took the documents out and filed them in a box in the basement, with all the other paperwork from that period of my life. The empty envelope stays on the refrigerator as a reminder, not of the investigation, not of the money, of Clara's letter, and what it cost me to finally understand what she meant. I want to tell you something about family financial abuse, because I've learned more than I wanted to know about it in the last 2 years. The National Network to End Domestic Violence estimates that 99% of domestic abuse cases involve some form of financial control or exploitation. 99%. But when we talk about domestic abuse, we focus on physical violence, emotional manipulation, verbal cruelty. We don't talk about the quiet theft, the money that disappears, the credit cards opened in your name, the inheritance that evaporates, the unpaid labor that's taken for granted until you're so deep in the hole you can't see daylight. Financial abuse in families is particularly insidious because it hides behind love, behind duty, behind the idea that family helps family, and if you ask for accounting, you're the one being selfish. It works like this. First, they establish that you're useful, you're good with numbers, you're good with paperwork, you're responsible, you're trustworthy. Then they establish that you're available. You've got time, you're between jobs, you're retired, you're grieving, you're looking for purpose. Then they establish that asking for payment would be inappropriate. We're family. We don't keep score. You wouldn't charge your own blood. And then they take your labor, they take your expertise, they take your time, they take your money, they take your identity. They keep taking until there's nothing left to take. And then they look at you like you're the problem for finally saying no. The second statistic you should know, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that 37% of identity theft victims are defrauded by a family member. Not strangers, not hackers, family. People who have your social security number because you gave it to them for insurance forms. People who have your signature because you signed birthday cards together. People who have your trust because you believed family meant something. I was a fraud investigator for 23 years. I've seen every scam you can imagine. Romance fraud, investment fraud, elder fraud, pyramid schemes, Ponzi schemes, wire fraud. I've built cases that sent people to prison for decades, and I didn't see it happening to me until I'd lost 16 years and $2 million. You want to know why? Because I wanted to be needed. Because after Clara died, I was drowning in purposelessness, and Greg offered me something to do. Because doing his books made me feel competent when everything else in my life felt broken. Because helping family felt noble, and nobility was easier than grief. I chose to be useful. Greg chose to exploit that. Those are different choices. I'm not responsible for his crimes, but I am responsible for my blindness. If you're listening to this and you recognize the pattern, if you're the one who always helps, always shows up, always fixes things, always says yes, and nobody ever asks if you need anything, I want you to do something for me. Look at the numbers. Actually look at them. Add up what you've given. Add up what you've received. Add up the hours, the dollars, the favors, the emergencies you've solved. And then ask yourself, if you stopped helping tomorrow, how long would it take for someone to check if you were okay versus checking if you could still help? That answer will tell you everything you need to know. I'm not saying don't help your family. I'm saying document it, track it, notice patterns, notice when requests escalate, notice when gratitude disappears, notice when your presence is only welcome if you're useful, notice when you've become a service instead of a person. And if you notice those things, if you see yourself in the pattern I'm describing, please talk to someone, not someone in the family, someone outside, a friend, a therapist, a lawyer, a financial advisor, someone who can look at your situation without the contamination of family loyalty, because family loyalty goes both ways, and if it's only going one way, it's not loyalty. It's exploitation wearing a family reunion t-shirt. I think about Melissa sometimes. I think about her sitting on that wet grass in her bathrobe, watching federal agents carry boxes out of her house. I think about her working at that Sprint store, helping strangers with phone upgrades, living in her parents' airport apartment. I don't feel good about it. I don't feel bad about it. I feel nothing about it. She made choices. She chose to participate in Greg's fraud. She chose to coach the accountant through covering it up. She chose to seat me at the kids' table and exclude me from family photos and tell people I was unemployable. She chose wrong. The consequences are hers to carry. People ask me if I regret reporting Greg to the FBI, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I think 7 years in prison is too harsh for what he did. I don't regret it. I don't wish anything. And no, 7 years isn't too harsh for 16 years of systematic fraud. But I'll tell you what I do regret. I regret the 16 years I gave him before that. I regret every time I said yes when I should have said no. I regret every time I processed payroll without asking why my name was on documents for money I never received. I regret every time someone insulted me and I stayed quiet because making waves would be inappropriate. I regret being so afraid of being alone that I accepted being used. Clara tried to warn me. She knew. She saw what I couldn't see. That I was valuable to people but not valued. That I was needed but not loved. It took losing her to understand what she meant. It took losing everything else to finally believe it. The bakery is crowded this morning. A family just sat down 3 tables over, grandparents and parents and 2 small kids. The kids are arguing over who gets the chocolate patsky. The grandmother is negotiating. The grandfather is reading the newspaper and ignoring everyone. It's a beautiful morning. Cold and clear, the kind of November day where the sky is so blue it hurts to look at. I have nowhere to be. No one is expecting me. No one needs me to fix anything. I used to think that was loneliness. Now, I think it might be peace. I finish my coffee. I leave a $5 tip for the waitress who's worked here since Clara and I started coming. I put on my coat. I walk home slowly. Past the church with the copper steeple, past the house where the old Polish couple feeds stray cats, past the corner store where Clara used to buy scratch lottery tickets every Friday because she said hope was worth $1. I let myself into the bungalow. I take off my shoes in the entryway like Clara always insisted. I hang my coat on the hook by the door. The house is quiet, warm, mine. On the refrigerator, held by Clara's magnet, the empty manila envelope catches the light from the kitchen window. I make a sandwich. I sit at the kitchen table. I eat slowly, and I think about all the ways we betray ourselves by staying quiet, all the ways we disappear, trying to be necessary, all the ways we mistake exploitation for love because we're so desperate to belong somewhere. I think about the woman at the bakery, Nancy, Clara's friend, saying Clara would be proud of me. I think maybe she's right, not because I destroyed my family, but because I finally chose myself. There's a difference. I want to hear from you. I want to know where you're listening from, what this story brought up for you, whether you've ever been the invisible provider in your own family. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what you would have done in my situation. Tell me if you've ever had to choose between family peace and self-respect. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt seen in some uncomfortable way, do me a favor. Hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about people who stayed quiet too long and finally spoke up. Because these stories matter. Your story matters. And maybe hearing mine will help you recognize your own before you lose 16 years to it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.